So tonight I thought I picked this topic because it's fun and something that I bring up a fair bit, and people always think it's amusing and they love the question, how are you resourced? So I decided to make it a workshop or whatever we're going to call it. I'm curious about coaching. And because there are a few new faces, I will just introduce myself. I am a pediatrician and I am a former institutional physician leader. I used to hold a lot of different leadership roles, and I think they inform what I do now, which is coaching full time. And I also teach yoga a lot, and any of you are welcome to join me. It's my passion project, and I facilitate a lot of retreats. And then I'm also a mom, a wife, and a grandma, a new grandma. So I share all that in the spirit of how are you resourced and looking at sort of the things that you have. And all of those are resources or training or skills that I have. And this curious about coaching sessions, I basically do them for fun and sort of as a gift. I like to teach a topic and share a little bit about it and then answer questions and do some coaching if we have time. And my intent is that a lot of people have a lot of skepticism about coaching, and or they're just kind of interested to see what it's about, or sometimes the specific topics that I throw out there are of interest to people. So I invite people to come and learn a little bit and hopefully go home with some tools, even just from the 45 minutes or an hour that we spend together. So this topic, how are you resourced, is specifically intended to help people step out of scarcity mindset. And why I was inspired to share this topic is that I actually don't know, I'm going to say any physicians or people in healthcare who don't have negative impacts from a scarcity mindset. And I think that the impact of scarcity and approaching life from scarcity is brings a lot of negative outcomes for physicians. And so I think calling it out, noticing where it is, and then ideally giving you tools to address scarcity mindset is a really powerful project. And so when we focus on scarcity, i.e., the time we don't have, we feel rushed and anxious. When we focus on the energy we don't have, we tend to feel overwhelmed. When we focus on the resources we don't have, which is something that happens in medicine all the time, you feel stressed and not valued. And when you focus on the potential lack of opportunities or good outcomes, you tend to feel stuck and anxious and worried and tight. And so I think it is really helpful to notice this pattern and shift your thinking. And so the intention of what I'm going to share today is, number one, to introduce you to this great question. I often talk about not great questions, but how am I resourced is a great question. And then to help you explore what it feels like to feel resourced. And I'm putting the attention on what it feels like. And I hope that you will go home recognizing that we were trained in medicine to see how we're not resourced, even when we are resourced. And I hope that you will be willing to practice feeling resourced on your own, because it feels amazing and it's a great thing to practice. What we practice grows. And realizing that when we connect with resourced, that's where we are empowered to move forward and we can change and transform. When we feel the scarcity mindset, it's very hard to change because it activates the fight or flight. It makes us feel threatened. It makes us feel depleted. And so when you connect with how you're resourced, that's an anti-overwhelm strategy, an anti-burnout strategy, and it allows you to transform. So I thought we would start with a pause and taking a moment to actually connect with our inner resources and the breath as a resource. And also because when we settle in and practice a little bit of mindfulness, your nervous systems will all be much more receptive to what I have to say. And so it will help you, you'll feel better, and you will be better able to connect with this idea of stepping out of scarcity mindset, which for many people is triggering. And so I invite you for just a moment, and you can Close your eyes if that feels comfortable or leave them open, but find your sit bones and connect them into the seat wherever you're sitting. And if you're driving, please don't close your eyes. And notice even the stability of the seat that you're on. And you're resourced by having something underneath you, holding you up, keeping you comfortable. And notice your breath, breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. Noticing the breath as a resource to bring oxygen everywhere. Let the carbon dioxide go. And notice it's a resource to feel better. And as you are here, perhaps bring a hand to heart and another hand to top, something I teach often, realizing that you have the capacity and to send yourself good thoughts, compassion, kindness, and that connecting with the idea of being resourced is just that. It's sending yourself compassion and kindness. It's actually resourcing yourself. And as you sit and breathe and notice your chest rise and fall, you can notice how your body is resourced in that it can do all of these things well, functionally. And taking a moment to think about your life right now and how you likely have so many of the things that you wanted previously. Letting go of all the things that you don't have yet that you want. But perhaps you have a roof over your head. Perhaps you have a car. Perhaps you have a medical degree of some kind. Perhaps you have a job today. Perhaps you have some money in the bank at least. Perhaps you have a partner or children or friends or parents. All of these things are things that we all want. And then when we have them, we don't pause to notice how many resources and supports and people in our lives we have. Drawing your attention to how in this moment right here, you are safe. And you are secure. And as you notice your chest rise and fall, think for a moment about your strengths, the things you're good at, the expertise that you have, the training that you have, those things that make you uniquely you. Letting go of what might need to be improved, what still needs work. Looking forward. And perhaps connecting to how much schooling you have. Definitely a resource. How much education, the skills and wisdom that you have now that you did not have before. And the ability to likely practice some kind of medicine in some way. That is a resource. And connecting to your health as another resource. Are you mostly healthy? Once again, letting go of the one or two things that might not be working, or even more things. But what things in your body are working? And come back to the breath, which is working and is available to you right here. Breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. And notice how you feel when you connect with the things that are working, the resources you have, the experiences that you have, letting them in. When you're ready, you can lower your hands and open your eyes. And for anybody who wants, you can turn on your video. It's always nice to see a few faces. And I thought I would start, as I often do, just reminding us of these default mindsets, and scarcity is a default mindset. And we were trained to notice how we're not resourced. And the first step in stepping out of a scarcity mindset is literally to notice it, to notice how we were taught to notice what we don't have, or what's missing, or what's wrong, what our patients don't have access to, what our clinic doesn't have access to. We also notice the lack of sleep, the lack of food, the lack of time. For many of us, time with family, lack of vacations. And we also notice those who are not resourced. And in medicine, that's the lens. Most of our meetings are focused on those kinds of things. And so it's no wonder that we default to scarcity when we are stressed, essentially. And then the next step of getting out of scarcity mindset is literally to slow down enough to notice your relationship with scarcity, is what I would say. Notice how it impacts your decisions. And I recommend pausing and just thinking about how many decisions do you make or have you made from fear, anxiety, not enoughness. There might not be another opportunity. This might be your only chance. You're lucky to get this job or job offer. And thinking about whether you want to keep making decisions from that lens and that mindset. And once you've noticed it, once you see it, then you can change it. And I would say not just see it, but accept it. Accept that this is the lens that perhaps you've been moving through the world with. And I think it's not just in medicine, it's cultural for many of us. And so our next step is to attend to the resources that you have. Literally pause and be present and notice those resources. And so that's what I tried to do with that mindfulness exercise, noticing what you have, noticing the things that you have that you always wanted to have, noticing how it feels to have them. And then you can work on retraining your body and your nervous system and your mind. And I will say that we really can't retrain one without the other. And so if we are in sympathomimetic storm or fight or flight, it's very hard to feel resourced, very hard to focus on resource. When our nervous system is going wonky, it's very hard to make change. It's very hard to be present with how you are resourced. And so when we want to direct our attention, we actually have to be in a healthy neurologic state. We also have to be not depleted. And that's sort of the body, knowing what it feels like to connect with the breath. So this is one of the reasons why I think things like yoga and mindfulness can really help you begin to shift these very sticky mindsets. And scarcity mindset is very sticky. For many of us, when we have been in scarce settings, we feel very threatened. And if you just think back to residency times where we had a scarcity of sleep and food, when you're feeling threatened like that, it's very hard to not let that scarcity mindset just seep into every nook and cranny. And so realizing that retraining your body is part of it. And then the mind retraining is what we really think about when we think about coaching. And so what you think is actually determining these feelings of scarcity and or feeling resourced. And so when we pay attention to things we don't have enough of, we feel scarce, we feel fear, we feel anxiety, we worry. When we pay attention to how we are resourced, which we practice doing a little bit above, then you actually feel more resourced. And so you can focus your mind on words like bounty, enough, or abundance, or good outcomes. I sometimes think it's helpful to say mostly good, or there's lots of opportunities. Sometimes we can't quite get to abundant. You can even get to neutral. Neutral is resourced generally. That's why it's such a powerful emotion. The other thing is telling stories that acknowledge how resourced you are. So telling the story of how many years you've trained to do what you did, how many years of education you have, how many years of experience you have, how many times you've done something. Or if it's the first time, you can then look at your experience perhaps. So there's always a different crack to sort of let yourself acknowledge that you have resources, rather than our default, which is we don't have resources. We haven't done it very much. We don't feel confident. Maybe we don't know how to do it. Same thing if you're thinking about, say, looking for a job. We tend to think that there is a scarcity of opportunity out there. And yet, what if there's 10 jobs out there that you would love? And that just eases the pressure. That's feeling resourced, feeling like you have all that you need, and there's plenty of resources out there to meet your needs. The other way I like to think about this is noticing inner resources versus outer resources. And we tend to focus on outer resources, money, houses, so generally like people and things. And those are important. And when we think about resources, we focus a lot on that. But we also have our inner resources, and those are actually much more in our control. And they are what I would say, not optimized tool. And so you can focus on your mind and literally retraining your mind to focus on how you're resourced. You can work on your physical body and your cells to retrain them and your nervous system so that it is familiar with this feeling of resourced. Our nervous system and our cells are all familiar with the feeling of not enough resources. And I just, again, want to bring up that in medicine, that was always the conversation in my clinic. As a chief, we never had enough resources. Whether it was supplies, nurses, people, time, whatever it is, we didn't have enough of it. We didn't have enough doctors. And that's the energy with which and the lens with which we look at things. So it's no wonder that we feel burnt out and exhausted. I think the other inner resources are that training, your wisdom, your skill set, the things you know how to do. As physicians, we are professional problem solvers, professional decision makers. We make so many decisions, and yet we often think we're not good decision makers. And so realizing that we are exceptional decision makers. We are also fast learners. We're hard workers. We're clearly capable of change, but we tend to focus on how we're not as good at that or how there's a scarcity of something in that area. And yet you can look at the other side of it. And I know sometimes people think that's Pollyanna, but I would say at least look at how much you have as often as you look at how much you don't have. And most of us are completely out of balance there. And then I wanted to get back to this idea of questions, because how are you resourced is a great general question that twists your lens to resourced, abundant, bountiful thoughts. But you can also ask more specific questions. And Rachel Naomi Remen, who is someone I love, she's a physician. She's in her late 80s now, but she wrote My Grandfather's Blessing and Kitchen Table Wisdom. And she ran a course called The Healer's Art when I was at UCSF. And now it's at many, many medical schools across the country. And she has these 3 questions, which she calls them anti-burnout questions. But what I noticed about them is they're really how are you resourced questions. And so she recommends that people ask at the end of each day 3 questions, which are what inspired you, what touched your heart, and what surprised you. And that's really looking at the resources, it's not just a Pollyanna thing, it's looking at all the things there that you have at your fingertips that are available to you. So I have what I call my pause and presence questions, which are a little bit different. That they are really like, what did you do well? Not what went well, because that gives away your power, totally not in your control, but what did you do well? What happened? What did you do that you're proud of today, for example? Or how many years of training and experience do you have? Especially, I do a lot of coaching with fellows, and so they feel very inexperienced, and yet most of them have been training for 10 to 12 years to do whatever they're doing. And so I think it's actually helpful to look at that. How long have you been training to do what you're doing today? It's years and years and years. And then all of a sudden you feel a little bit more grounded and you can connect with your strength. The other question that I brought up in the mindfulness exercise is, what do you have that you've always wanted? That's another super powerful question that for most of us, we always wanted to be a doctor. And here you are. And then we're looking at all the things we don't have, because that's our lens. And so what things in your life do you have that you always wanted? Maybe it's a dog, maybe it's children, maybe it's to live in a certain place. There are so many things that when we were 16, we really wanted, and now we have it and we don't even notice it. So the invitation here in what I'm sharing is that when we look through our life with a scarcity mindset, it's disempowering. So we tend to move through our days in fear. We feel tight and stretched and stuck. For many of you who are thinking about making a change, I think it's a really helpful lens to say, wow, well, why do I feel stuck? It's usually because you see a paucity of opportunity or a paucity of things that will work out well, rather than focusing on how you're resourced, what tools do you have? When we look at life through this scarcity mindset and are not connecting to how you are resourced, you tend to not be creative. You tend to not be curious. You tend to not be patient. And these are all tenets of mindfulness that I think are really helpful. And so when we come at things from scarcity, we tend to be reactive rather than responding intentionally. And so that pause comes when you pause and connect with actually how you're resourced. It will help you feel resourced and ask better questions. And so when you feel resourced, when you ask how you're resourced, you feel resourced, then you feel differently. You start noticing totally different things when you feel resourced. You actually notice how even more things that it make you resourced. You also start to see how you can actually become more resourced. And moving in that direction, all of a sudden you make more change and things look better and better. So I would encourage you at some point to sit down and think about this question, how are you resourced? And maybe explore some of the questions I mentioned and really looking at specifics, inner resources, outer resources. If you can, you think about the breath as a resource, you can think about the chair you're sitting on as a resource. It's really retraining your brain to notice these things. And what we practice grows. So the more you practice feeling resourced, the more resourced you will feel. And when you feel resourced and notice those resources, as I mentioned, you can appreciate them. You can actually use the resources. If you don't notice them, you don't use them. I like to think when you're resourced, we also optimize our resources and we create more, grow more, engage in more. And so this is when you shift your mind in this way, it shifts everything. I would just say it's life-changing to approach things from that way. And I think the challenge is, how do you do that? Because we are so practiced in the rote habit of noticing how we're not resourced. We also believe that if we were to just sit here and think about how we're resourced, something bad would happen and we would miss something. And it gets, we need to be hyper vigilant about what we might not have. And yet, when you connect to being resourced, you actually have more resources and more solutions. The feeling resourced is what gets into releasing oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine, right? It feels good to feel resourced, as opposed to the scarcity mindset, which is releasing cortisol and norepinephrine. So you're really turning on the parts of your brain physiologically by practicing these questions that help you solve problems and actually be more resourced. And so asking this question and exploring it, I like to say all the nooks and crannies of it, or for those of you who work in a place, my former employer used to have something called 360 evaluations. And so if you can explore feeling resourced from all the directions, how you want to create it, how it's already there, where does it exist inside and outside, then you just get really familiar with it. You're practicing using it. Your brain is getting comfortable with it. And realizing the first few times you practice it, it will be uncomfortable. And it's okay to just realize your brain's going to say, no, no, you can't stay here. You have to go back to your old habits, because that scarcity mindset is super, super deeply stuck in there, because we are so, it's just really, really sticky, because most of us experience scarcity as trauma. And this lens towards the scarcity came during traumatic, difficult times in our training and or in our lives. Many of us grew up with that scarcity lens. It's a habit that's widespread in our culture. And so while I will offer there all these tools, it absolutely takes time. And I always say you have to give it time, meaning don't expect it to happen overnight, not bringing your urgency bias. See, I've failed, I'm just going to stay here. And you also have to invest the time in changing, actively practicing. And for most people, I think it takes active coaching, honestly, because the scarcity mindset is so rooted and sticky. It's hard to retrain. And so you have to continue practicing. I find in my coaching, it literally comes up in every session. It's often surreptitious, but it's there. And so I think it takes you committing to it and oftentimes someone else to point out how it's often influencing your decisions. And that is one of the reasons why I do long-term coaching, like small group coaching, because people practice it month after month after month. That's when it begins to stick. We can willpower our way into it, but practicing it over time with this compassion and kindness and in community, you're approaching it not from this judgmental space and not from a scarce space, but you have plenty of time to rewire and train your brain differently. And that, I think, is absolutely key. So at that, from here, I'm just going to open it up to people who have questions, or if people want coaching, I'm happy to jump in and give you all some coaching. So feel free to unmute and ask your questions.